My name is Cindy Lauper, and your name is going to be Mud if you miss Saturday night's main event. Because if you don't wrestle, you don't rock.
Battle of the Network shows. Join Rick Brooks and Mike Kogel as they explore the TV of the 70s and 80s through hand-picked episodes of their favorite and not-so-favorite series. Hey everyone, welcome back to Battle of the Network shows. Got another episode. This is Rick here with my friend and co-host Mike.
Hey.
And today, I mean, you could argue that this whole podcast has been leading up to this moment for me. I finally get to talk about something I watched maybe more than just about anything else as a lad, professional wrestling. Are you ready for a professional wrestling episode, Mike?
I'm going to try.
Okay.
I didn't watch professional wrestling, or wrestling, as some people might call it. And I honestly don't know a whole lot about it. Most of what I know is either from talking to you or watching Glow on Netflix. Not the actual Glow wrestling, but the TV show about it.
Well,
you know, and I did watch that cartoon a little bit.
Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling?
Yeah. But other than that, I mean, you know, it was around. I grew up in the South, so
yeah.
The WCW, right?
Yeah, that was
the Turner one.
The NWA, then World Championship Wrestling.
Yeah.
Georgia Championship Wrestling, and Crockett Promotions. There's all kinds of stuff going on.
I know my dad at the first job he had when we moved down there, they flew a lot of charter planes, and some of their clients were the wrestlers. And they'd fly them to, I guess, other locales.
Right.
And of course I've mentioned Mr. Wonderful, Paul Orndorff, owning the bowling alley.
Yes. It's good.
You know, and
we're going to see Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff in this episode.
We are.
That we're covering today.
That's right.
Well, you may not know that much about pro wrestling, but I know way too much about it, so
yeah.
Hopefully we'll balance each other out, and I suspect many of our listeners might be kind of in your shoes.
Yeah. So I do know that, you know, there's a lot of jargon involved.
There is.
And I don't think we're going to get into moves, really. I mean, there's that jargon, but I know it seems like they're terms that at least fans use. Mm-hmm. Or is it only, I guess, some fans? Depending what your interest in the thing is. Yeah,
well, I mean, we're going to be talking about something from like 1985, kind of right around the sort of modern wrestling boom. And I think fandom was a little different back then. Mm-hmm. Now, because of the internet partly, and you know, sort of everybody knowing everything about everything, and as wrestling has, you know, sort of resisted, you know, used to resist pulling back the curtain, and now it's kind of embraced letting fans in more. So you see a lot more of these terms that it used to be just quote unquote the boys or the workers would use these terms, and now like generally fans use them, and you kind of get split reactions to whether wrestlers themselves like fans doing this or they get annoyed by it.
Yeah.
So, but I find a lot of these terms are actually pretty good in everyday life, and I try to incorporate them whenever I can.
Right. So there's the heel.
Yeah.
And that's your villain.
Right.
Sort of. Was it face? Is that the?
Yeah, face, short for baby face.
And that's
the good guy.
Good guy. Mm-hmm. That's about all I know. What's the? You've used it on the show before, but kayfabe.
Oh, kayfabe, yes, is you know, kind of like a code for, you know, keep it under your hat. Like, don't keeping it kayfabe is like, you know, the worked or, you know, sort of fake nature of it.
Yeah.
Like,
I guess worked, that would also be one.
Yeah, like a work would be something that's staged, you know, whereas a shoot would be like real legitimate. Like if you were to be like a character on the show here, like say you were Madman Mike or something. Mm-hmm. Like Madman Mike would be sort of your work name, but your shoot name would be, you know, Michael Kogel.
Okay. And what else? Like, I feel like I've heard you use like gimmick. You know?
Yeah, gimmick is like a lot of stuff like that. You know, gimmick could refer to just like the guy's character or something, but also like especially like Steve Austin uses this a lot. Like he'll refer to these things in the bill, things in the mail, these gimmicks in the mail they call bills. I got to pay those, So, use it kind of like, or use it to like accessories and use it kind of broadly. But as far as this podcast goes, let me see, like, okay, for example, we gave, I think one of our things that we've done in the podcast is we've given a big push to search.
Yeah.
We've tried to put it over.
Right.
And that's kind of what like promoters will do to a certain wrestler. They'll give a certain wrestler a big push by giving them lots of wins, lots of airtime, in the hope that he gets over with the crowd, meaning becomes more popular.
Okay.
So those are some that come in handy too, probably.
Yeah. Jabroni? No.
Well, we've talked about lots of jabronis.
Yeah.
I think maybe Jabroni might be the guy in Search Of that claimed that Amelia Earhart was living at Leisure World,
Right.
New Jersey.
So other than I guess jabroni, these other terms you don't really hear like on this. The announcers aren't calling so and so a heel or so and so a face.
Correct. Yeah. Like actually, there was sort of like a parallel language. Like one of the things that I grew up watching, in addition to watching television, I read like the newsstand magazines were real big, the wrestling magazines, and they would refer to like the ones I read, the so-called After Mags, which is named after one of the sort of public face of the magazine company who was a photographer and kind of like an editor with them, fan favorite and rule breaker. Uh-huh. So they use that terminology. So you kind of, it's the same idea, but they'd kind of say that rather than say heel or baby face.
A writer,
but
hero, or villain.
The announcers on the show would never sort of use that. I mean, every now and then something you might slip in, but they were kind of all about keeping it kayfabe and sort of maintaining the illusion for the, for the audience.
Okay, let me ask you that. And this is not about the actual wrestling itself, but in terms of the story or the sort of the personas these guys are playing and how fans responded to that. Like, I can see like a little kid watching this and believing these are the people. Mm-hmm. But I guess I would have trouble seeing an adult buying into these personas as this is how these people are behaving in everyday life.
Yeah, so we're getting to the crux of it, aren't we? The main question.
Right.
That a non-fan asks a real fan. And in many ways, I'm not saying that you're in this category, but especially back then, this is the question you get. That's fake, right?
Right.
It's like, which is true.
But again, I'm not even talking about the competition part of it.
Right.
It's all of and I think because what we're going to talk about in particular had devoted a lot of time to the non-competition part.
Yes.
It's just like, it seems fairly clear they're doing bits. Mm-hmm. So,
well,
but then I could see like, especially the competition part, like if you're in an audience watching that, like live, like not on TV, but like you're in Madison Square Garden or the Meadowlands in the case of one we're talking about, like the actual wrestling, I think probably does look legit.
Especially if you're not looking for it.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, there's a couple of things I'd say to all that. I think one thing is there's sort of like an assumption that there's the old stereotype that people are rubes and don't know that it's predetermined. But I don't think that it was ever the case. And actually, I think if you go look, people don't realize that even back in like the 30s and 40s, there was a big skepticism about pro wrestling, and people knew that it wasn't on the up and up for a long time. I think the key was, I think a lot of fans, they'd like to buy into the illusion and be part of the show and not have their intelligence insulted.
Right.
Now, we're going to talk about Saturday Night's Main Event, which is part of Vince McMahon and his push towards a more showbiz glamour kind of style with more emphasis on out-of-the-ring stuff, skits and stuff, and less of an emphasis on the in-the-ring product.
Right.
Now, when I was growing up, I sort of liked and resented this because I liked more of like an athletic style that was more about the in-the-ring stuff. Mm-hmm. And actually those magazines, they were very notorious for kind of siding with like the other promotions like, the NWA and things, and against the WWF because the WWF was more showbiz, was more cartoonish, was more geared towards kids, and more emphasis on out-of-the-ring stuff, looking more quote-unquote fake.
Yeah.
So for me, I mean, that's all part of it, and it's hard to suspend disbelief when you're watching a lot of this stuff, and that's the problem that I think a lot of other people had with a lot of the stuff that WWF was putting on. Yeah. So, yeah, I think the answer is that the people realized that it was all, but I think some wrestling promotions and presentations and TV shows made it a lot easier to suspend disbelief than like Vince McMahon did, which admittedly was geared more towards a more general mass audience, and especially more towards kids, right, which you saw like in the massive merchandising and all that, in the cartoon show, things like that. But really, I think if like a lot of those competitors, the ones that like Vince McMahon would refer to with disdain as wrestling, if they had the opportunity and the platform to do what he did and use cable TV and reach a mass audience, they gladly would have, because they would have made money. Yeah, and that's what Vince McMahon did.
Right. And like in an event like this, like would the live audience be seeing some sort of feed of that kind of stuff?
At the time, probably no. I mean, nowadays you would.
Yeah.
Like nowadays, when their main flagship show is like Raw, and they have like large TV screens that people can see all the backstage stuff, and it's more integrated. This was actually like, I don't even think it was live to tape so much. It was a pre-tape, and a lot of times the people in the arena probably wouldn't see a lot of the stuff that was going on backstage. Yeah. And as a matter of fact, I think some of the segments that we saw on the show were not even taped. We're not even necessarily taped at the arena.
Right.
They just put a lot of it together in post-production.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the big innovations. And we're talking about Saturday Night's Main Event, which was a big deal, and I think it's a good example of sort of like the glitz and glamour and this more showbiz aspect of it. It's a big change from like in the 70s, kind of like the beginning of the Battle of the Network shows era. Wrestling was mostly like studio wrestling, a lot of it. So you'd see a weekly TV show from like a territory, and you'd have your local wrestling promotion, and you'd see some matches taped maybe in a studio setting with a small audience. Maybe dim lighting, not so much production values. Then when Vince McMahon came in, his idea was to use cable television, go national, bring in like large production values. Importantly, he kind of took away all the TV time slots and drove a lot of the promoters out of business, because they were used to maybe bartering or something with TV stations to get their airtime, whereas Vince McMahon would go in and pay for it. And he'd get this network of stuff, and you'd see stuff like Saturday Night's Main Event with like bright lighting and production values, music, popular music, and everything. It was just like a whole nother world from some of the studio wrestling that people were sort of used to. And especially if you didn't grow up watching like your territory, like with your guy and your champion and everything, you see this stuff come on, and it's like, well, this makes like the other stuff look small time, because it looks like the major leagues. And that was kind of the intent.
Okay.
And actually, like this episode, well, I'll just say this was the second ever Saturday Night's Main Event. And it aired October 3rd, 1985. And it was actually taped 2 days before at the Meadowlands. So it was only like a 2-day turnaround. So they turned around pretty quickly. I think as the show went on, there became more of a gap. Normally they tape like 3 or 4 weeks ahead. But they always presented it as if it was plausibly live. So they sort of give the illusion that you're watching a live show. And this, of course, was a sort of a fill-in for Saturday Night Live, which, Saturday Night Live would be on 11:30 p.m., and Saturday Night's Main Event would go in that 11:30 p.m. time slot.
Right.
And it was the brainchild of Dick Ebersol, who was running NBC Late Night at the time, and became buds with Vince McMahon, and still is to this day. And they kind of saw, I think it was inspired by the success that WWF had running on MTV the year before, the couple of specials, and they had this brainchild to do like a occasional sort of fill-in for Saturday Night Live, and it was a huge ratings hit. So the first one was just after WrestleMania, which the first ever WrestleMania was earlier in 1985, and this was, about like 5-6 months later. The second ever Saturday Night's Main Event is the one we're going to talk about today. So yeah, the first ever one was in May, and the other thing that I kind of point out is like, nowadays there's a pay-per-view or some kind of big event every month, but that back then pay-per-view was kind of a new thing. And so really, instead of like pushing everything towards one specific event, they're just generally doing like, it's a wrestling special, but they're not gearing towards a specific pay-per-view event that they're trying to get you to buy. They're really just trying to build up stuff that people will go see at house shows, they call on the road, like non-televised events.
Right.
And still at the time, like right now, wrestling is driven by television, the television money and the rights fees. Whereas back then, the goal was still, it's a touring company, and the idea is to get people to buy tickets to go see what they're putting on. So in Saturday Night's Main Event, this was a big deal because, like, as a kid, I'd be watching wrestling on a Saturday morning, like the two shows, just the two WWF shows alone on New York television. Then there'd be shows on USA. But a lot of them, they just had like, they'd be called squash matches, where like a push wrestler going over some jabroni. Or occasionally you'd get a couple of you'd see some title changes, some good matches, main event quality matches. But most of the time, they were saving that because they weren't concerned about television ratings. They were just trying to get you to go see it in person. Mm-hmm. So you wouldn't see the good stuff. They'd save that. So Saturday Night's Main Event was a huge deal growing up because you'd actually see people that wouldn't wrestle on TV. Like Hulk Hogan rarely wrestled on television, but you'd see him almost every Saturday Night's Main Event wrestling, some other star wrestler. So it was actually a really big deal. And you take the production values and everything, combine it with these so-called main event quality matches, and you get something that's worth staying up for. So that was kind of what was really revolutionary about this, and kind of a cool thing. Even if I didn't like it as much as some of the other wrestling that was out there, this is definitely a big deal. And they would also take some of the matches they would do would be on the Saturday Night's Main Event show. They would take matches that they had been doing around the horn, in arenas, and then they'd sort of what they call the blow off would be the end of the feud. Since it already burned out in the live arenas, they'd go ahead and put it on TV a lot of times. So Saturday Night's Main Event, you would either get matches that didn't really mean much but were designed to showcase some new guy, or you'd get something that would start a feud between two wrestlers, or you'd get a match that everybody's already paid to see this in live, so we'll go ahead and put this on television and get something out of it on TV. So that's kind of what Saturday Night's Main Event was all about. So yeah, so the show starts with a montage of sort of pre-taped segments, or some of the wrestlers hyping up what's going to happen. That's something that happened pretty much every episode.
I was entertained with the choice of theme music.
Yes, Obsession by Animotion.
Yeah.
Yeah, which they basically are just playing the instrumental part of that.
Right,
and
yeah.
It works, and growing up, I identify it so much, which is why it's a disappointment these shows are on the WWE network, but they replaced the music. They didn't bother to clear it, and it's just not the same.
Yeah.
They've got another theme, and for a while, on this one, they didn't have it, but eventually they adopted Phil Collins' "Take Me Home" was the outro song. So they played that at the close. And I
think take Me On or Take On Me.
Yeah,
I can remember was during one of the
bumpers, yeah,
the bumpers,
going into going out of commercial breaks, they'd play that, yeah. So that was kind of a big deal, and it's just a shame that all that music. That's why we watched a version that was not on the WWE network that had the original music intact, which was good. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily think this sort of semi new wavy poppy song would be good for a wrestling show, but it's so ingrained in my mind. And the way it's edited, the editing and with the graphics and the titles and stuff, it's a really good job of editing. So
it actually does work. That would be the last song.
Yeah.
From that era that would be
I mean, you
wrestling
think
song.
Maybe something a little harder or something or more aggressive, but I totally associate that song with Saturday Night's Main Event.
This particular Saturday Night's Main Event, I guess the frame of it is the wedding of Uncle Elmer and Joyce.
Yes.
Is Joyce a wrestler? Or
Joyce was not, and
is
actually,
his real wife?
Well, this was actually a shoot wedding.
Good.
The wedding was legitimate, and the story goes that Uncle Elmer, who had wrestled in the territories, in the South mostly, as Plowboy Frazier, he came in as part of this hillbilly gimmick. Uh-huh. Vince McMahon has a history of loving hillbillies, so he joined these hillbillies, and he told Vince McMahon that he was planning on getting married, and apparently Vince McMahon had the idea to put it on TV and get some ratings out of it, and that's the result you see. Apparently, this is a real wedding.
Which seems to be controversial in the wrestling world.
Indeed, and this is Jesse Ventura and Vince McMahon are the announcers here, and Jesse Ventura was a heel announcer. He wasn't the first to do it, but he was one of the best.
That jumped out. I was really interested. I'm he seems to be intentionally being a jerk.
Yes.
The whole thing.
That's totally his deal, yes.
Yeah.
And he was not the first one to do it, but on a national level like this, he was definitely one of the first to do this, and he was very, very popular. And part of it was he was funny, but he also said stuff that a lot of people were actually really thinking.
Yeah.
He'd call out Hulk Hogan for doing eye rakes or illegal moves or something like that. But in this thing, I'm glad you mentioned this because he actually says early on that this marriage has no business in wrestling.
Yeah.
And I agreed with him. You know what I mean? I don't want to see a marriage in a wrestling show either. So it's good for him. He should be ripping on this.
He can't. There's no place for wrestling.
Yeah, so I'm all in favor of that.
But even there's a point. I guess it's this Right. During the ceremony, which they do in the ring, like he's making all these wiseacre comments the whole time, and and it lets Vince McMahon be a little, just, oh, come on.
Yeah, taken aback.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I didn't, again, having not seen a lot, but seen just enough to, like, I kind of enjoy when the morally outraged announcer bit.
Yeah, yeah.
Which there wasn't a lot of in this, at least.
Right.
Like, oh, that's unbelievable. Oh,
yeah.
What is, like, like, at least in the Man in the Moon movie, like the wrestling, when there's, when Andy Kaufman and Jerry Lawler first encounter each other and the announcer there.
The great Lance Russell, who was really the announcer during that time, as he's playing himself.
Okay, yeah, I figured. And
and that was one of his best things. Like, oh, come on, Andy. He's just very indignant.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. And Vince McMahon is actually pretty good at that, too.
Right.
In a different way. And he and Jesse made a great team, and they were normally on the main syndicated shows. They were on different shows, but Saturday Night's Main Event, that's another thing that sort of made it more special, is the two of them came together to form a team. And Vince McMahon, of course, was the key creative person, but for years and years, it wasn't acknowledged that he had anything to do with it. He was just playing an announcer role, and was known for not calling moves or anything. And some people kind of mock him, but now you kind of appreciate him a little bit more as far as getting the storylines over.
Right.
Although he does say the word "notwithstanding" way too often. I think in the intro to this, he says "notwithstanding" about 5 times while he's rattling off what we're going to see in the show.
Yeah. Where do we start?
After talking about the marriage and setting that up, we go right to what actually is the main event, wrestling-wise.
Yeah. Why do you think that was at the top?
So we start off with it's a world championship match with Hulk Hogan, who had already been the champion since like 1984, so almost 2 years at this point. Mm-hmm. And he'd go on to have another couple years. So he's in a flag match against Nikolai Volkov. And this happened a lot. Hulk Hogan would usually wrestle like in the first match, and I think the reason was just because the television audience was largest at 11:30. They'd put Hogan's match on first, and then just kind of like, usually like the last match in the show is kind of maybe the least important one on Saturday Night's Main Event. And the reason being the audience dwindles is what the expectation was from 11:30 to 1. So they make sure they get Hogan and the main stuff out of the way first. And then, they'll have other stuff to keep people, but Hogan they usually let off with the main attraction a lot of times.
So they, based on experience or whatever, knew that it would drop off, and they accepted a drop off rather than trying to keep people around by anticipating the big thing.
Yeah, I think they were looking at like projected viewer patterns and just figured, well, let's lead off with like our main thing that we want to promote and stuff. And it's usually Hulk Hogan, and he's usually the biggest attraction. Plus, I think they figure at 11:30 at night, it's better to start off with your biggest attraction rather than expect people to wait around. Like a traditional, like if you went to an arena, you might wait around all night to see Hulk Hogan in the quote-unquote main event. You'd wait till the end. But, I mean, that's one thing because you're sitting there, you're a captive audience, and you're buying popcorn and spending money on other stuff. But on TV, no, you might as well get him on first and hook people right away, I guess is the thinking.
So Jesse Ventura has like his reaction, like Hulk Hogan does, was his big speech about the Russian guy and how the Russian guy carries around the flag and everything, and he's giving this super patriotic speech. And Jesse Ventura seemed to be kind of based on what we know about him later, like a shoot representation of some of his beliefs. He's like, well, it's a free country. Yeah. That guy wants to carry around a Russian flag. He can do that. Yeah,
which is funny considering, Jesse Ventura was a Navy SEAL, as he often reminded people. Right. Too. He loved to remind people, and he claimed that it was Agent Orange that had him retired because he had a blood clot in his lung, which is true. Mm-hmm. That's why he had to retire from wrestling, apparently, and he claimed that it was remnants of Agent Orange. But, I mean, that's kind of an example. Like, Jesse Ventura would say a lot of stuff that actually kind of makes sense. Yeah. Like, and it's something like me and my friends used to love to do, too. I mean, it becomes fun to sort of use heelish ways, but, like, say things like that. And when we'd go to wrestling shows, like, you'd be saying things like, hey, Hogan's got no right. I remember seeing Hulk Hogan wrestle Randy Savage at the DC Armory years ago. Uh-huh. And I was kind of I hated Hulk Hogan then, and I was doing a running commentary, and Hogan was, he would go after, Sherry was Savage's manager at the time, I believe, and Hogan would go after her, and I'd be like, Hogan has no right to put his hands on a woman. What's he doing? Or something like that. And I just remember a guy sitting in front of us, looked around at me, looked around at my dad, almost like if my dad wasn't there, he might have gone after me. Uh-huh. He said, well, she's got no right to to be interfering in the match anyway. And I just kind of like laugh. But it becomes kind of fun to do, actually. Okay. But Hulk Hogan actually is doing some kind of, nasty things. Yeah. I mean, they wrestle. and he wrestles Nikolai Volkov. He beats him with a leg drop. It's kind of a slow and plodding match.
I saw that happen, but I didn't register.
I mean,
how he
this is an example. It's like the WWF was known for more big man wrestling and not as much athletics. So these two guys, I mean, they're kind of going at it, but they're not doing like a lot of like exciting moves or anything. They're kind of big guys plodding around. And Hogan wins with a leg drop, which I thought was the lamest way to beat people. And that's one of the reasons I hate him, because he always won with a leg drop. So then he takes the Russian flag, and he's like spitting on it and like, doing all kinds of like folding it up and being totally disrespectful to it. And part of his reason was because Nikolai Volkov comes out, and one of his gimmicks was he'd ask, the ring announcer would ask everybody, please rise, while Nikolai Volkov sings the Russian national anthem.
Right.
Which is always, a very stirring rendition, and usually you'd have like Jesse Ventura be like, I think it sounds pretty good. These fans should show the proper respect, And he's got no right to sing that here, Yeah. And fans would boo him just for singing the Russian national anthem. And
his manager is Fred Blassie.
Yes, former grizzled veteran, a former wrestler, and at this time well past his physical prime, and kind of limited as a manager, But so Volkov was tagging with the Iron Sheik too around this time, and they were like tag team champions for a while, and they were pretty big. The Iron Sheik being from Iran, they were a big heel duo because they played on the whole Cold War tensions and everything. So they were some of the most hated guys around.
Does the current WWE use any kind of characters like that, or they're being more sensitive?
That's a complex situation.
North Korean?
Every now and then they'll try. Over the years, they've put like in recent years they've had Arab characters. They've flirted with terrorist gimmicks. They're very good at using poor taste. And recently they've had I don't really watch it anymore, but I'll still follow it. And they've recently used like an Indian guy who's actually I think from Canada but of Indian heritage, and they used him kind of to try to get heel heat. A lot of times they'll go back to that foreign character trying to get, the fans to boo him just because he's a foreigner and he's talking about how great his country is.
Yeah.
They've got a guy, Rusev, who's from Bulgaria, and for a while he had a manager that was supposedly, she's actually from Florida or something, but she was doing a Russian accent, and they were trying to claim that they were wrestling for Vladimir Putin and trying to get people to boo them that way. So, yeah, they still do that, but it's not quite as explicit as it was back in the old daes.
Yeah, I don't have anything else about that.
About Hulk Hogan and Nikolai Volkov.
Other than Hulk Hogan was not wearing his trademark yellow.
Yeah, no, I guess he had like his American-made shirt. He wear sometimes he wear like white trunks and mix it up a little bit. But yeah, I guess mix it up and get people to buy different merchandise.
Right.
Every now and then you throw something else in. His American-made was a big seller, in addition to his red and yellow. But yeah. So Hulk Hogan is all over this show, and he was all over this match, but he emerges victorious, still the champion. And next they have another peek at the at the wedding because Uncle Homer wrestles next, and there's something I wanted to point out that made me laugh. They're showing the bride like getting ready, and they're kind of like showing her kind of like from the back, kind of keeping a respectful distance as she's getting presumed. And McMahon points her out, and Jesse Ventura's like, "Yeah, but McMahon, isn't that dress just a little bit off-white?"
Yeah.
And I started laughing at that. And to use another term, Vince McMahon no-sells that. He doesn't acknowledge that line, but I was cracking up at that.
Is that a wrestling?
No-sell.
I didn't.
Yeah, like.
I guess I just have heard you use that so much.
It's become
and
second
use it.
nature.
That one's certainly become part of my.
Yeah, well, that's a good one, doesn't it? It comes in handy.
Yeah. So, do you think he's implying something about her?
Yes.
Virtue.
That's exactly what he was going for. I think. Yes.
I thought too. But it could have just been about their hillbilliness too.
Yes. So next we have the hillbillies come out. I was never a fan of this gimmick either. I never liked the hillbillies. They were terrible in the ring. But so Uncle Homer wrestles Jerry Valiant, who is at this point he was well past his prime. He was a former tag team champion, but he's disposed of pretty quickly in supposedly record time here.
6 seconds.
Yeah,
right?
6 seconds, which is funny because they show like at WrestleMania the record was supposedly set by King Kong Bundy.
It was like 9 seconds.
Yeah, it was 9 seconds, but they show the whole match and it's like 30 seconds.
Yeah, that one went way longer.
Yeah. Well, that's an example of, wrestling, close enough.
Yeah, this really was. He just climbed in the ring and boom.
And, like, fell down on him. You give him a body slam. Yeah. Yeah, this was closer to 6 seconds than the other one was the 9 seconds. Yeah. King Kong Bundy, that, like, went forever.
Yeah.
for that always cracks me up that they build that as. But it's wrestling.
Yeah.
The weights and heights are never real.
Right.
Usually,
Yeah,
so.
because like Uncle Omer, they say is like 456 pounds.
Yeah, I don't think that's a shoot weight.
He's a big dude.
It's close, probably close to it though.
Yeah.
Now his height was, and later we'll get to Andre the Giant, who was famously built his way over his actual height and weight too.
Right.
But so Uncle Omer wins over Jerry Valiant, and they do a little dancing in the ring, the hillbillies all dance.
Yeah.
And then they, show King Kong Bundy. So they're setting up something down the road for Uncle Elmer and King Kong Bundy, I guess. And they're giving Elmer a chance to show his stuff before, the wedding.
And Jesse points out that they have new bib overalls.
Yeah, well, that's very, very classy, yes. They show Brennan Tartikoff and Arnold Schwarzenegger,
right?
Which is kind of an interesting combination. Give a little star power.
Yeah, when I was watching it, I didn't know about the NBC part of it. So the Brandon Tartikoff was mildly more surprising than it should have been.
Yeah.
And what really wasn't that much, but I thought, he's just studying the entertainment value of it or something.
Yeah.
And I didn't see him. They just said I thought I saw Schwarzenegger, but when they had that shot, but I didn't notice.
Yeah, I think he was like kind of to his left. I think you can kind of see him there, but yeah. So they never miss a chance to point out a mainstream celebrity if they can show one. So next, then we get the Body Shop segment, which they have interview segments, and the Body Shop was something that they did. They do it in the ring here, and Jesse Ventura is the host of his interview segment. Like Piper's Pit was the most famous one, and they would have that on the main syndicated show, and Jesse Ventura would have the Body Shop on All Star Wrestling, which is kind of like the secondary, the B show at the time. He actually had a set where it was presumably like a gym or something like that. This time they just do it in the ring, and he has Bobby the Brain Heenan, who would become pretty much the number one heel manager. And at the time, he was really kind of picking up steam as an act, and one of the best managers of all time in history. And he's kind of basically coming out to talk about what he's got going on. He's got a bounty on Paul Mr. Wonderful Orndorff, your bowling alley guy.
Yeah, I didn't understand at first what that like a bounty.
Yeah,
to kill him,
to take him out,
in the ring. Right.
Yeah, this is a comment. Well, sometimes they leave that kind of intentionally vague so as not to be too violent. But I guess the idea is, you can collect the bounty if you ambush him on the way to the ring, maybe, or in the parking lot. Yeah.
Right.
Whatever. So you got a $50,000 bounty because Paul Orndorff humiliated him.
Right.
And at the first WrestleMania, the whole thing. So this kind of leads into a match with Paul Orndorff against Rowdy Roddy Piper.
Yeah.
They were tag teams in the main event of the first WrestleMania against Hulk Hogan and Mr. T. Paul Orndorff wound up losing that match, and Roddy Piper blamed Paul Orndorff for it, and that has led into this feud here. So this match is basically continuing that feud. Nothing's resolved, but they're just kind of advancing that story. And you've also got Mr. Wonderful dealing with Bobby Heenan.
Yeah.
He's fired Bobby Heenan, so Bobby has this bounty on him, and Piper wants to collect the bounty.
Right. Okay.
So the two of them have a big brawl, and it's actually pretty.
I was the wrestling that part of it. I think I found theirs the most entertaining.
Yeah.
Partly because it seems like Roddy Piper, like his personality is like a little different. Maybe it's just his voice is different. Like he doesn't sound like he's from the South, and he doesn't. I don't know. He's just got an interesting sounding voice.
Yeah, he's got that way of talking, And, I'll tell you something, brother. He's always kind of. He always kind of has that halting delivery, like he's that his shtick, but always like he's possibly under the influence of something, and probably was many times. But
and I remember like on the Hulk Hogan's rockin' whatever. Like I mean, he was sort of was he an actual villain on that, or was he just like the classic like annoying character?
Yeah, I think he was like the leader basically of the villains.
Okay, there were actual villains. Yeah, I can remember.
Yeah, because it was like him and they'd hang out together, like Iron Sheik Volkov and Fabulous Moolah would all hang out together, and then Hogan and his pals would like hang out together.
Right.
But Piper, he's clearly one of the most charismatic guys, and he's really like looking pretty big. I mean, he's not a naturally big guy, but I think he had some chemical enhancements when he came into the WWF because it was a big man's territory. Yeah. And but Piper, he could talk your way into the building.
Comes in with bagpipes.
Yeah, he always had the big. And actually, he and Orndorff formally split up at the first Saturday Night's Main Event was when they really, like, I mean, WrestleMania kind of started, and then shortly after Saturday Night's Main Event started their feud, and it's still going on at this point. And yeah, they have this wild brawl, and
not only end up out of the ring, but like they go under the broadcasting area and into the back, and like are fighting, and I think Roddy Piper finally like locks himself in a dressing room.
and this is pretty unique for WWF television. I mean, other, like, some of the territories would have these, like, brawls all over the place, but they used it sparingly. Usually it would stay in the ring, and especially in WWF, this is kind of unusual and kind of a cool thing. And it was very exciting, but it went way too short. I mean, this is probably the best match in the show, and unfortunately it was only maybe 5 or 6 minutes, it felt like. But
right, and they're both disqualified.
Yeah, it's like a double count out, but also had one of my favorite moves ever. It was, and I know my dad used to always like this whenever he'd be, forced to watch it with me or something. Piper does his little eye gouge where they're like in the middle of the ring brawling, and he just like sticks his fingers out and just pokes it right, just like a quick boom, right in Paul Orndorff's eyes, and then that turns the whole tide for him. Yeah. Just a very simple eye gouge.
Three Stooges.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or as an eye poker, as Vince McMahon refers to it, a gouge in the facial area. So that was the highlight of that match for me. But so yeah, that's Paul Orndorff. So how do you feel about a guy that a respectable bowling alley proprietor being embroiled in such a
well, this is before he became
situation.
A bowling alley proprietor. Yeah. So you got to be able to do after you retire, you got to be able to do something. People can change, right?
Sure.
I never saw any brawls in the bowling alley.
That's too bad. People weren't brawling all over the concession area and spilling nachos all over the place.
Like no one ever walked into the bowling alley and just called him out. Yeah.
Well, maybe that's a good thing. You don't want that during league play. That would be disastrous.
Or maybe they would, and then they would settle it on the bowling alley.
Yeah. Special first ever bowling alley match.
I'm going to get a turkey and take you down.
Well, that notwithstanding, we have we go to the wedding, I guess, is next. The wedding to Joyce Stasko, I think was her last name, and they're actually reciting dialogue, and Jesse Ventura, like you said, is making like Weisenheimer comments the whole time.
Right, like because Uncle Elmer like gaffes a couple of the lines. And,
and he's squinting the whole time. He is nervous, and Vince McMahon even says he's nervous, Jesse. And,
right, yeah.
And Ventura's saying stuff. Not only can't he read, he can't hear either. Because he's asking the reverend or whatever to repeat things, and and then he lets him kiss the bride, and Jesse Ventura says they look like two carp in the Mississippi River going for the same piece of corn.
He says it twice.
Yeah, because Vince McMahon asks him what, and then he repeats it. I tell you. Jesse Ventura, at the time, I mean, he was really kind of like I said, there were other people doing similar things, but Jesse Ventura really was a breath of fresh air. Because a lot of, like, the wrestling would have, like, a local guy, a hero, kind of not saying anywhere near stuff like this. And it was very refreshing to hear somebody say this. And Ventura kind of went over the line into some questionable racial and sexual comments many times. Stuff that wouldn't hold up today. But if you can't make fun of two hillbillies and having a wedding in the middle of the ring, what can you make fun of?
And when the minister, who I believe is like is he like the ref or something? He's some official other title. He's somehow vaguely involved with the stuff. But when he asked if anybody objects, Roddy Piper shows up and there's no room for romance again.
Yeah. I mean, they're making good points. Piper and Ventura are saying, wrestling's, and really it isn't a place for romance. Right. It's not a good place for long-term relationships, I'll tell you that, because they usually don't last in wrestling for a variety of reasons. When you're traveling on the road, but
did somebody chase him off? I forget what happened.
Well, the wedding does go through.
Yeah.
And I think Piper just leaves.
Okay. He just makes his speech and leaves.
Yeah. He said his piece.
Right.
So that was the wedding. What do you think? How do you rank with? Oh, you know what? And maybe I should bring this up now, even though he shows up later. They keep making these references to Tiny Tim.
Right.
Like they're really deliberately making a thing of that.
Yeah.
Like the first wedding in over 20 years or something. Not since Tiny. I guess it wasn't 20 years, but so So
like
Tiny
15
Tim,
or something.
yeah, married Miss Vicky in like 1969 on the Tonight Show.
Yeah.
And that was a huge event.
Right.
For some unknown reason, people were very interested in that.
Yeah.
And they keep referencing it, like kind of, I guess, to put this in the same sort of TV history as that wedding.
Yeah.
So,
I don't know.
Yeah. How do you rank this with memorable TV weddings? You had Dynasty. You had.
Well, but I mean, they're treating it well, and you said it was a shoot wedding, so I think that's what they mean. It's the first legitimate, like, actual wedding on TV.
Right.
And they're making it seem like it's live too. I think.
Yeah.
First live wedding on TV since then. Yeah, I don't know. Compared to not really. Well, they're ignoring Prince Charles and Princess Diana.
Yeah. Well, hey.
That wedding was probably more popular than this one.
That's probably true, but.
I mean, it wasn't on a television show per se, but it was televised.
Well, in fairness, did Prince Charles ever beat Gentleman Jerry Valiant in 6 seconds?
Well, no.
I don't think so. Yeah.
No.
Advantage Elmer.
Yeah.
There was some real emotion in this wedding, though. I think it.
Yeah.
And and you had the hillbillies in the ring, Hillbilly, and
Right.
Cousin Junior, and I guess Hogan is hanging around. And
Yeah, he was there.
Hogan, I like Hogan in this episode. Has his the sleeves cut out of his.
His tuck shirt.
Yeah, very classy. Yeah, maybe not one of the best weddings in TV history, but it was one of them. So
Yeah.
there's that.
It takes a little of the elegance out of a wedding when people have to step through, like, ring ropes.
Yeah.
There's nothing graceful about doing that.
No, it's
Other than when Andre the Giant just steps over them.
yeah.
But
And it's my experience that when you're getting married, you don't want anything else to worry about. You
Right.
don't want to have to worry about tripping on anything or running on anything. So
Yeah.
I give Elmer credit for, he had to wrestle a match.
frankly, I was waiting for it to, like, devolve into some brawl.
Yeah.
But it was in the middle of the show, so I guess.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising in retrospect that it didn't. I mean, it
Yeah.
seems like a little tame now. It's like, well,
But I guess since it was a real,
I think
it couldn't.
what they did, I think they did have some matches with like the Hillbillies against like Roddy Piper and Bob Orton, and they did have some tag team matches as a result of this. As a result of Piper and Ventura making the comments. Now Ventura was pretty much retired from wrestling at this point, so he couldn't be a full-time wrestler. Mm-hmm. But he could still make fun of the Hillbillies from the broadcast booth and kind of instigate.
Right.
But yes, that's the wedding, and this is the kind of thing that would not be seen. Certainly not in this format on like your on TBS or something like that.
Right.
This kind of angle would not be seen on those other shows.
I guess we already addressed it a little bit, but so even compared to the other WWF programs, was this like the percentage of non-wrestling stuff higher in this because?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's the case. And actually, for years and years, the WWF, especially before, like, I'd say 1984 was when Vince McMahon Jr. really takes over and really starts kicking up. But for years, the WWF had one of the most boring TV shows. It was all, like, uninteresting matches and had very few, like, angles or, like, stories or, like, what you'd call an angle would be, like, somebody coming out and attacking somebody or somebody turning on somebody and turning bad guy, whatever. It'd be very rare on WWF television, whereas Saturday Night's Main Event, in addition to these matches, they would also have these angles and kind of stuff, and both out of the ring and in the ring, which made it kind of more exciting. Their normal syndicated television, they would have stuff go on, and they'd have like little skits and segments, yes, but it was amped up on Saturday Night's Main Event. So next, there's an interview with Bobby Heenan. He's kind of talking about his giant tag team, King Kong Bundy and Big John Studd, and that kind of leads us into the next match, which is Bobby Heenan's tag team against Andre the Giant and Tony Atlas. Tony Atlas was a former WWF tag team champion. He was only about 30 years old at the time of this, which surprised me because he was kind of like on the downside of his career at this time. He had some unreliability issues, which is kind of a code for, or another way I could say is he had his demons. And so he was unreliable, and they couldn't really do a whole lot with him. But every now and then Andre would have these matches with a guy where the partner would be like a normal, which is funny because Tony Atlas is a huge guy, but compared next to the other guys, they'd have basically a guy in there to take the pin or get beat up so that Andre could just come in and dominate. And really, this match was all about furthering this feud between Andre and Big John Studd and Bobby Heenan. There wasn't much to it. Andre had beaten Big John Studd at WrestleMania in a body slam challenge where he won like $10,000 for body slamming Big John Studd and then threw the money to the crowd. And But it wasn't like the same as kind of like getting a pin on him. I mean, I guess there's some credibility for Big John Studd, so they could continue wrestling. And then they brought in Bundy, this huge guy, and so you get the nice visual. And they attack Andre and his cracked sternum that he had suffered before. They showed a little thing on, and that actually happened on one of the syndicated shows where they held Andre down so they could give him the big splash and right across that sternum. Oh. So they go back to work on this, and this match is basically just a way to kind of keep that going and have Hulk Hogan come out and run out and make the save, which would set up a match on the next Saturday night's main event, Hogan and Andre against Bundy and Studd. So Andre was a big attraction anytime, but Andre and Hogan is a much bigger deal than Andre and Tony Atlas.
Yeah.
So Andre the Giant, a fabled figure, a lot of myth about him, and there's going to be a movie coming out next year, which I'm very much looking forward to seeing. But I'm looking forward to see how they handle some of this, because he was billed as like 7'4". He wasn't nearly that tall. He was billed as like 520 pounds or something. He wasn't that heavy, but he was a big guy, and he did drink a lot. But there's a lot more to him than being big and drinking a lot. But that's a lot of times what you hear about Andre the Giant. But you could tell even now he was deteriorating. When he was in the 1970s, he could actually move around pretty quick. And then you see footage of him when he was younger. It's amazing, like how much he's moving and stuff. But at this point, the condition he had that sort of caused that massive growth, it was catching up to him, and he was physically starting to deteriorate now. So, but at this time, he was still kind of like a big attraction that WWF would use, and not really in the championship picture, but expected to be a big box office draw, because hey, go see Andre the Giant in person, why not? Were you impressed by the eighth wonder of the world, Andre the Giant, Mike?
I was impressed, like I said, about him just being able to step over the.
Wow.
He still was pretty big.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, I mean, he might not have had as much agility to actually step on it. It's
well,
a good thing he could step over the rope.
The other, when he first came out, tagged up or whatever, and it was just like choking. Just had his arms stuck out and was choking.
Yeah.
Was it King Kong Bundy? I don't remember which guy it was, but
yeah,
that was. Even though I knew he wasn't really choking him, it was still.
He's got big paws.
He does.
I mean, his hands are huge, and think about it. I mean, that's kind of one of those things. Like, some of this stuff doesn't seem like that legit, but if you think about it, if a guy that big actually choked you, yeah, you'd be in a world of hurt.
Yeah. Even if you had a really thick neck.
Yeah.
Those guys did. Yeah. I would say my concentration drifted during the matches, at least towards what was happening. Like, I was listening to the interplay of the announcers, and it kind of just,
You were more looking for some Greco-Roman style scientific wrestling.
Scientific wrestling, right?
That's understandable.
Yeah. Was that the match where Vince McMahon said there was no scientific?
It may have been, actually.
It was just brute.
Yeah.
Brute force.
So Andre would go on eventually, and actually he would wrestle Hulk Hogan in the main event, which was seen by he'd wrestle Hulk Hogan on live TV on NBC on a Friday night in front of 33 million viewers, which is a huge number, and they did an infamous angle there, and one of the biggest broadcasts in wrestling history. That would be like 2 or 3 years down the road, but for now he'd just keep on kind of feuding this, and King Kong Bundy would actually go on to headline WrestleMania 2 in early 1986, wrestling Hulk Hogan. So pretty soon they'd be kind of transition Bundy over into attacking Hulk Hogan. So, and this was kind of leading the way for that.
Okay.
The other thing, like back then, they do what they call the booking, like organizing the storylines and everything. They do that more by the seat of their pants now. Back then, Vince McMahon probably had a lot of this stuff all kind of scheduled out, and you kind of like to know by October. You actually should probably know in general where you're going to go for WrestleMania. I think he probably had a pretty good clue already where he was going with that. So, not much to that match though. Next though, we go. Okay, this next thing is one of the segments that I used to kind of hate. It was a pre-tape segment with Mean Gene and George the Animal Steele.
Yeah, and that more than any of the other things was the thing, because George the Animal Steele is literally acting like an animal.
Yeah.
I'm just like, well, it just made me curious about the question I asked earlier about, what does a fan, what are they buying into? What are they not buying into?
Right.
Are they fully aware that these are characters and they just like the characters and they're buying into that, and then the wrestling another part of it, or because it's just obviously a bit,
right,
much more than any of those other things, where it could just be people hyping themselves a little bit by being a little bit over the top.
Right. To me, I didn't like it, and I didn't really buy into that, and I kind of resented it.
Yeah.
I remember even back then, though, that there's the story had gone around that, hey, he's actually like a high school teacher in Michigan, which was true, and which is pretty funny to think about it. But yeah, this kind of character now, if they had said, like, if they gave you some kind of out, like, or some kind of indication that he was doing as an act,
right,
to like psych out his opponents, I'd be more, down with that. But this is like, no, they actually show him going through electroshock therapy and trying to change his ways and going around this zoo.
Like he's been living in the zoo.
Yeah, right.
Hiding in the bushes.
It's Mean Gene Okerlund, who I actually like Mean Gene Okerlund, but he's kind of doing straight men and doing these like little glances to the audience, which he was very good at. And it's like when wrestling tries to do comedy, it's never that great.
That definitely, like, in all of those kind of things stood out to me. It's like, just non-professional people trying to be funny.
Exactly. And that's something that's plagued WWF for years. To me, like, some of the things I like best about wrestling over the years were things that weren't really trying to be funny, but were just like, that's cool. And we'd laugh about it and think that it's funny, but it was actually like good wrestlers actually just saying funny things or being their characters and maybe doing something very violent that would make us laugh or something. But stuff like this with these skits, I didn't dig this at all.
And I guess Glow had a lot of that kind of stuff too, right?
Yeah, Glow was even worse. Glow was all that stuff. There was it was all artifice. I mean, there was hardly any emphasis on the in-ring stuff in that at all. So you can imagine how I felt about Glow. Mm-hmm. But you know what? I still watched it sometimes. I watched all of it.
Yeah. I guess mostly from the cartoon, because Mean Gene was in the cartoon, right?
Yeah.
How do you feel about the way they treat him?
The way they treat Mean Gene Okerlund?
Yeah.
The way who treats him like
it seems like the wrestlers all treat him like a little kind of condescendingly.
It's interesting you say that because I think Mean Gene has a kind of a condescending attitude towards a lot of the wrestlers.
Okay.
So I think it's a lot of give and take there.
Yeah.
Gene had sort of come up in the AWA with Hulk Hogan, and it was a buddy of Hogan and helped a lot. He was like the main interview guy in the AWA, so he came over kind of around the same time Hogan did. And I mean, especially as Gene got older, he'd always seem to be kind of like putting himself over a lot. But I think he was really good at helping move the interviews along. But I don't know. I'd probably see it more the other way around. But I see what you're. I think I see what you're saying.
I think we forgot to mention that he at least sat at an organ during the wedding. He supposedly played the organ during the wedding.
Yes.
Every shot they had of him looked exactly the same.
Yeah, you're a little skeptical.
Yeah, at first I thought maybe he was, but then his hands weren't really doing anything. I mean, they were holding chords or something, but they weren't. He was playing like the wedding march.
Yeah.
And there was no. He didn't look like he was playing a melody.
Well, I don't.
Which is fine. I don't criticize him for that.
He did do a fine rendition of Tutti Frutti on the wrestling album. So he does have some chops there.
Yeah, and of course, Jesse was mocking his organ playing too.
Yeah, he was. Yeah.
McMahon.
Yeah.
Was just he made a couple mistakes.
Yeah. Mean Gene, he'd be in these skits and stuff, and he did a lot of these. And one of his main roles, though, was like especially like on they do insert programs in the syndicated shows with Mean Gene interviewing guys, and they'd be talking about, hey, when I come to, Cleveland, or when I come to Erie, Pennsylvania, whatever, I'm going to do this, and Mean Gene would kind of keep those things going. So that was like his big asset. Every now and then he'd be at ringside at calling the matches, but as time went on, he was like their main interview guy. And Saturday Night's Main Event, they used him a lot to do this stuff too. He was good at that, and every now and then they try to put him in these comedy roles, and I think he was better like I think he was funnier like in an actual wrestling context, just in these interviews with kind of a smirk sometimes than he was like actually in these comedy skits. But
and I guess he would get kind of stuck in between like if an interview with people who were going to face off against each other.
Yeah.
He would get stuck in between that.
Yeah, they didn't do that quite as much back in the WWF as they would other places. There was more of a separation, I think. They'd usually kind of save that kind of thing for the ring, but yeah. The main thing of this is just George the Animal Steel.
Yeah.
He's wild, he's crazy.
Right.
And
he's hairy.
Yeah, he's very hairy. Maybe you had a laugh at this is what they're hoping, I guess.
Right.
I think we're getting to the last match here. The final match, the team of Leaping Lanny Poffo and Tony Gurria. Late Lanny Poffo is the brother of Randy Macho Man Savage. Came in at the same time as Savage did. They didn't acknowledge that they were brothers. and he was pretty much a preliminary guy. Didn't enhancement talent, as they would say today. Didn't win very many matches, but he did a little poetry gimmick. He'd read poems before the match about his opponent, usually throwing an insult at his opponent at the end. Mm-hmm. And Tony Garea was a former tag team champion. Like in the 70s, he was a big deal in WWF, but at this time, again, on the downside of his career, mostly enhancement talent, and later became a road agent, kind of like a producer with the company. But they're just fodder here for the current tag team champions, the Dream Team of Brutus he became Brutus the Barber Beefcake. He was Brutus Beefcake and Greg the Hammer Valentine. And, yeah, they were the tag team champions, and they make pretty short work of Garea and Poffo. Valentine wins with the figure 4 leg lock, which is a submission maneuver that you can actually do in real life. And my friends and I would always try to do it. It was Valentine's move, but more importantly, it was the finishing move of the NWA World Champion, Nature Boy Ric Flair, who was a favorite of ours at the time. So it was a big deal to try to get somebody in a figure 4 leg lock. And if you did it the right way, it would actually hurt somebody. So, yeah, Valentine and Beefcake, the tag team champions, and their manager, Luscious Johnny Valiant, was kind of an odd character and not really a top-line manager, but he was a friend of Vince McMahon's, and so he had a job for a long time. And not much to say about this. They were tag team champions for a while. I think they would eventually lose to the British Bulldogs, and they would come in, and when the Bulldogs came in, they were an actual, talk about breath of fresh air. They could really wrestle, and they were spectacular, and they were just when the British Bulldogs came in, compared to some of the tag teams they had, it was kind of like, to use this analogy again, it was kind of like the Wizard of Oz when Dorothy goes from black and white to color. It was just oh, wow, the whole world changed in WWF. At least for a viewer, I mean, it didn't really change a whole lot as far as the style of wrestling, but the Bulldogs really stood out. But now it's Valentine Beefcake. Valentine was a veteran. Beefcake was a younger guy, and they would put these kind of guys together. And yeah, they were tag team, quick match. And again, though, as I noticed, though, it's maybe the least meaningful match, even though they're tag team champions, and they put this at the end of the show. Yeah. The show is not over yet.
Oh, no.
Because we have the wedding reception. Yeah, and now, you didn't tear up during the wedding, I think, but did you tear up during the reception?
No.
How about when Elmer sang that George Jones song to his bride?
Yeah. That was nice. That was another, one of those things that made me think, they put a lot more of this stuff in here than... it almost... To the point where it almost seemed like if they didn't have to wrestle, then they could just do this stuff that they would.
There's been some people in wrestling in recent years that I think that's their dream.
Yeah.
They had a controversial guy that took over as one of the main writers who I think actually said that he'd love to do a wrestling show with no ring or something like that. And then kind of South Park kind of made fun of that approach years later. But yeah, this is kind of the when people think of Saturday Night's Main Event, this is the kind of thing that they'll really think of is segments like this. It was kind of famous for.
And this, I think, you're thinking this is one of the things that was pre-filmed, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Hulkster's there. Mm-hmm. He and Mr. Wonderful are at a table.
Yeah, so they're buddies right at this point.
Yeah. They're about the only guests who weren't hillbillies.
Right, and interestingly, I guess they sat, Ventura and McMahon were sitting next at their table too, right?
Oh.
Ventura and McMahon.
I think so.
Yeah, they were sitting at the table, which I thought was an interesting wedding seating. I'm not sure what the wedding planner was thinking, putting Ventura at the same table with Hogan, but
yeah. And Tiny Tim was there briefly.
Yeah, Tiny Tim made an appearance.
Yeah.
And I thought it was I liked that Tiny Tim gave some wedding advice, but they conveniently didn't mention that he divorced Miss Vicky.
No, I think he did say something about that.
He did mention that?
He said, I think he said it didn't last.
Oh, okay, I missed that. My bad.
But he gave them a ukulele.
Well, do as I say, not as I do, I guess.
Right, and a very colorful suit on.
Yeah. And
the big thing here, and this actually it really put together the Jesse Ventura part of it for me. So, there was some storytelling where he got up and he read this poem that all seemed beautiful, and then in the end it was some sour punchline.
Yeah. Something. Well, Lanny Poffo had given a nice poem earlier.
Yeah.
More in the spirit of the occasion. And then Ventura comes out and sort of gets progressively more insulting until at the end it's something like, I don't know, especially if you're a hillbilly. Ha 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 ha. You know.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, but he gets his. Now I'm forget. I know he gets cake on his.
Yeah, he gets. I think he gets pushed. Well, it's a tradition in wrestling that anytime there's a cake,
Yeah.
somebody's going to get
Fall in
pushed
the
in
cake.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Somebody's going to get a face full of cake.
And I know
That's what
there's-
happens to Ventura. I think it's Orndorff.
Yeah, because there was a point I remember, like when while he's doing it, they cut to like the shot where you see like Hogan's from behind and Orndorff, and you see him like, doing this look to Hulk, like,
yeah.
what's going on here? What's this about?
Yeah.
Like he's acting.
Wow. Yeah. They're both appalled at the lack
Yeah.
of class Jesse showed.
Right. So of course they ruined the wedding cake.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe not the best way to handle that.
Yeah.
Huh?
And then they laugh.
Nah.
But it was like, oh, okay. You really put together. Okay, he's being a heel through the whole thing, and so it made all his snide comments about the wedding part, especially, like, kind of work.
Yeah.
And as much as it could,
Yeah. Yeah, it was a sad end to the reception for Uncle Elmer, but
Yeah.
some might argue that,
Oh, there's a pig there too.
yeah, yeah.
Forgot about that. Because Uncle Elmer is a pig farmer.
I think Ventura had a crack about that too, maybe, but
He did, yeah.
Yeah.
There were a number of cracks,
Yeah.
but
yeah, and that's Saturday night's main event, and they did announce, I think, that when the next one would be.
They
So
said
they had it
4
scheduled.
weeks.
Yeah, something like that. It was at least like 4 weeks, and I mean, for me, again, this is back to the time you had TV Guide, but you didn't have like things planned out ahead of time. You didn't know the whole schedule, so
Yeah.
it was a big deal when you'd find out that a Saturday night's main event was going to be on. It was like, oh, awesome, and stay up late. So even though I didn't like the WWF as much, and it took a while for the NWA and those other ones to come in. So like by '86, like there's all kinds of wrestling on all over the TV. But yeah, I'd be very excited to stay up and watch this. I mean, it was cool, and the fact that it was on 11:30 at night kind of made it cool too. You're kind of staying up to watch. Oh, Saturday Night Live's not on, but Saturday Night's main event is coming on, and yeah, it was a big deal. It's a whole different product than what a lot of other people were seeing, and this was like national, going on network TV. A huge advantage for Vince McMahon and the WWF to get this kind of exposure, and stuff like this paved the way for them to really expand and go national and be running like 3 separate crews a night around the country and start building up pay-per-view, and the rest is history. So Vince McMahon, won the wrestling war, but a lot of the fans, it sort of missed another style of wrestling. They'd be a little bitter and disillusioned with the fact that this brand of wrestling took over, as opposed to like a more athletic-based and quote-unquote realistic style of wrestling. Because there's always goofy stuff everywhere.
Right.
But having an hour and 5 minutes of time, I mean, this was maybe, half that, if that, in matches, and the rest like in skits and segments and things like that. And that's the way, they used their airtime. But give the devil his due, was very successful, and it outdrew Saturday Night Live and was a big hit. Now, if it had been on every week, it wouldn't have sustained those kind of ratings. But as a series of specials, every 6 weeks or so, it did very well. So, yeah, Saturday night's main event, and shout out to all my friends I grew up watching wrestling with and participating in neighborhood wrestling with. It was a big part of our lives, and I watched way too much of it as a kid, and to the point where I'd get upset probably when I missed certain of the shows. But hey, what can I say? And I probably did watch more of wrestling than anything else, because there was 10 a.m. you'd have championship wrestling. No, 10 a.m. would be all-star wrestling on Saturday. 6 p.m. would be championship wrestling. Then eventually Sunday morning you got NWA Worldwide Wrestling and NWA Pro Wrestling. Then we got TBS on cable, and you got 6:05. TBS would have championship wrestling, would be 2 hours. You'd have Saturday night's main event occasionally. You'd have AWA wrestling on ESPN. Then ESPN started showing wrestling every weekday at 4 p.m. You'd have World Class Wrestling. Yeah. You'd have AWA at night on ESPN. Yeah. And you were reading the magazines. I'd see all these other wrestling around the world, and I'd be like, man, I wish I got that TV show. Wish I got that TV show. And don't forget, you also had, like on USA Network, you'd have primetime wrestling every Monday night from 9 to 11. You'd have All-American Wrestling on Sunday afternoons. You had Wrestling Spotlight, which I think was on syndication for you. So, yeah, there was a lot of wrestling if you were interested in it. And
Wow.
I was.
I have one last wrestling story, which is, I think when I was in kindergarten, this friend came over and he had a very southern accent, and he asked if I watched wrestling.
Mm-hmm.
And I had no idea what he was, like I didn't know what word he was saying.
Really?
It took it like a couple minutes probably. And then, oh no. I don't. I think I watched the Muppet Show.
I wonder what kind of wrestling he was talking about.
I mean, that was probably
So this
TBS.
This would be in Georgia.
Yeah.
So Georgia Championship Wrestling, probably.
And maybe, yeah.
See, I wish I watched had Georgia Championship Wrestling when I was growing up. That's not easy to find these days, some of it.
All right.
But yeah. So, Mike, I get the impression that you're not going to watch the rest of the Saturday night's main events, even though they're readily available.
I don't think so.
Okay. Well.
Sorry.
It's quite all right. You gave it a shot, and
Yeah.
I respect that. And yeah, I probably owe you one, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know what that'll be.
But it'll be soon, and I'll know it.
Sure. Something for next season.
Okay, folks. See, this is like a long-running angle between us. This will play out. We'll get the payoff to this one next season.
Right.
When Mike makes me sit through something.
Yeah, because in season 1, you made me sit through that Happy Days.
Oh, yes.
But then I made you sit through the Alf.
Yeah.
But on the other hand,
Wasn't as bad
we
as-
both had to sit through both of those.
Yeah. That's
So
true.
it's really not.
Yeah.
That's not a good revenge scheme if you have to go through the same.
Yeah, there's a big flaw in that.
Right. Yeah, so we'll see. We'll see.
I don't like the sound of that at all. I'm still a little nervous.
Yeah. We'll see.
This episode brought to you by Mean Gene's Organ Machine, Volume 3, all the hits of 1985, on the organ. This episode also brought to you by A Fistful of Tights, a new twist on the spaghetti western. This episode also brought to you by Hype. Join us next time for another exciting episode of Battle of the Network shows. Learn more, leave feedback, and suggest future episodes at battleofthenetworkshows.com. Follow us on Twitter at BatNetShows, and like our Facebook page, facebook.com/battleofthenetworkshows.
Big Mac to my house. I'll bring my guys. You have yours. I've got Junkyard Dog.
It's World Wrestling Federation Superstars.
I've got Brutus Beefcake. Here's George the Animal Steel. I've got Great Hammer Valentine. Ricky the Dragon Steel.
They're so real.
And Rowdy Roddy Piper.
Can you tell the difference? Wrestling Superstars. They're for real. Each sold separately from LJN.
Yeah!